Hello everyone, I am back. I'll tell you what I have been doing for the past month since this is relevant to this video. The start of February is the long-awaited time for our family vacation to Japan. Ever since the pandemic, we've always wanted to go to Japan because Japan is the destination where we would have the most fun on the trip. And since the world is starting to open up again, there's no time like the present. But my main point of this segment is, because we will be away from home for quite some time, I won't be able to access my PC, which is mostly where my work and games are from. I have a laptop, but it is very slow right now, that it basically is unusable for anything really. You'd rather just spend your time walking around Japan than waiting for that laptop to boot up. So how do I cope with the spare time in Japan? Well, I pull up my Switch and start up the newly released Fire Emblem Engage. And boy, this is my #1 favorite game on the Nintendo Switch. Fire Emblem, I think, suffered through quite a lot of bad rap through the years. There's the infamous too many sword user thing going on in Smash Bros, which consists of mostly Fire Emblem characters. And I've heard that the franchise didn't go so well ever since Fire Emblem Fates. I haven't played Fates, but I have played Three Houses. In fact, Three Houses was my first Fire Emblem game. Three Houses, I think, is a great Fire Emblem game, despite being very experimental, like for example, the nature of the game being set in an academy, the fact that there won't be any new unique recruitable units throughout the story, the hyper-focus on the monastery itself, or that the game in itself is split between 4 different routes right off the bat. The Fire Emblem franchise will need to salvage a lot here to get the franchise right back on track, which is where Fire Emblem Engage comes in. Fire Emblem Engage was said to be the Fire Emblem for Switch, rather obviously with the design of the main protagonist. Fire Emblem Engage will go back to the roots of the classic Fire Emblem games, while also adding some more other minor stuff for a better modern experience. And for once, I think this is the first time a Fire Emblem game addressed the name of the franchise itself, Fire Emblem, because at first, that name is kind of a bunch of nonsense. I've played through the game myself in my spare time in Japan, and well, I am in love with this game. This game made me wish I was a Fire Emblem fan from the start of the franchise. So, where did this game got right? Setting things right off the bat, the gameplay is fantastic. Fire Emblem has been a game franchise that hyper-focused on the strategic feeling of war and on the battlefield. Not only with the RPG elements that they contain per unit that dictates how strong your units are, or the fact that they embrace the permadeath mechanic that means when one of your units die, they're gone forever. Fire Emblem Engage still holds that aspect of Fire Emblem, although with more options available that could make the game less daunting, especially for new players. You are free to choose casual mode to disable the permadeath mechanic, and there will be a time reversing feature similar to Fire Emblem Three Houses' time reversing mechanic, which certainly makes the game more accessible for new players. The game in itself, however, still holds how challenging they were. It is not like Three Houses where the difficulty is kinda messed up, where it is easier. The difficulty in Fire Emblem Engage is well tailored to be challenging. I am one of those players who will always seek challenge in any game and will eventually get bored at some rate if the game isn't challenging enough. Looking at you, Persona 5. There are some new systems in Fire Emblem Engage that also change the way you would approach combat, compared to what you would usually do in previous Fire Emblem, one of which is the break mechanic. Remember in Fire Emblem there is a mainstay mechanic called the weapon wheel, where swords are strong against axes, axes against lance, and lances against swords, using the break mechanic, where if you exploit that weakness, the enemy's weapon will break so that the enemy can't counterattack, which in normal circumstances, they will be able to counterattack. Another mechanic is the smash weapon, where there is a certain group of weapons, typically heavier weapons, that have the ability to push enemies by one tile. While they seem strong, keep in mind that your units can be affected by these mechanics as well. so you'll have to adapt with that, which shakes up the difficulty. In any way, from what I've experienced myself from a few chapters of the maddening difficulty, the game compensates for the fact that there are these new mechanics available to the arsenal, plus the existence of the emblem rings that will gradually be available to you within the main story. Oh, and speaking of which, the emblem rings. Fire Emblem Engage introduces a new mechanic to the Fire Emblem franchise called Engage. Appropriate to the game's title and story, engaging with an emblem ring will buff the unit that is equipping the emblem ring, with skills appropriate to each individual rings as well. These rings are represented by the heroes of past Fire Emblem games with different types of skills, from Marth, the Hero King, up to the latest, Byleth, the Professor of the Academy. These rings are probably nostalgia bait at this point, but honestly, I am up for it. These emblem rings not just made the gameplay a lot more interesting with the multiple combination of strengths depending on who you equip it on, but they also serve a great content for character banter. It's not every day that you'll see your units go buddy-buddy with heroes of the previous Fire Emblem games, and they are very entertaining. These banters are not limited for units to emblems only. In fact, they seem to have skimmed out a lot of potential character banter with the emblem bonds. Support made a comeback in Fire Emblem Engage that serves basically the same thing as bonds, but it is a banter between two units. It is somewhat like how Persona implemented social links, but it is broadened with having not just your main character as the catalyst of the banter. While limited, there's a certain combination of characters that have supports with each other. There are many of them, and the support system makes the character in the game more charming and alive, which also elevates the worth of each unit in battle to the point that you don't want to lose them. And that is straight up the best thing about Fire Emblem Engage. The fact that the game made a duality of characters, showing the characters' emotion and traits in a lively manner, while also being in a war setting, is just amazing. The game made me care about these characters, which makes losing them in battle from a strategic failure hurts more than any character deaths that was hard written in the game's main story. Well, speaking of the main story, I think we should address the elephant in the room, the story. This is where things get controversial, because from what I see online, the writing of the game's story falls off the more you progress. And I can agree to that, somewhat. So, the main story follows a standard amnesiac story where your main character wakes up forgetting everything. While the story will eventually explore the past of the amnesiac, the story will mainly focus on a standard MacGuffin story, followed with a standard plot of defeating the Demon Lord that is set to conquer the world. The skeleton of a story is there, but without spoiling the story, there's a lot of convenient Deus Ex Machinas to the point that it is bad writing. On the top of my mind, there's probably like 3 separate instances of Deus Ex Machina throughout different chapters, which I have to admit is ridiculous, but at that point, it is funny to me. Yes, the main story is very cheesy and campy. Anime story writing, especially shonen animes, have always been cheesy and campy, which, if I learned correctly, is not a strange thing for Fire Emblem as well. Again, without spoiling it, there are bits of writing in the story that makes the emblems become what looks like some tokusatsu or Power Ranger thing, and I actually laugh at that because it is so cheesy and cringe. However, the fact that Fire Emblem Engage elevates the cheesiness and campiness, plus that the music is top-notch, makes me enjoy the story despite its flaws. I have to admit, it is bad writing, but I am overly entertained by it. But through all of that is what I enjoyed the most, the conclusion of the story in Fire Emblem style. And it is why I personally love Fire Emblem Three Houses as well. Depending on your playthrough, the story will wrap up with bits of lore depicting what will happen after the story ends. Since the friends you made along the way are of a different nation and there is nothing that connects you to each other anymore, you'll split paths and go live your own lives. And that bit of lore is a closure to each character that you've bantered with throughout the game. This is also followed with stats on how much you've used everyone in battle, and most charming of all, the art of all the characters in the credits scene. These reasons are why, despite the flaws that the story had, I still enjoyed my time with Fire Emblem Engage. All in all, Fire Emblem Engage is personally my favorite game on the Switch right now. It is definitely not Breath of the Wild, but the combination of the gameplay, the strategic battle system, the character banter and bonds, the cheesy but entertaining story, these things clicks with me and I am wholly entertained. This is not including the Emblem characters, which I think is the best thing about Fire Emblem Engage. With the Emblem characters introduced within the story, and the banter and bonds between the units and the Emblem, I am now intrigued by the story of each Emblem characters that was introduced. It is kind of a bummer that I wasn't a longtime Fire Emblem fan, that I don't know most of these Emblem characters. But ever since I played and finished this game, I really wanted to explore the past Fire Emblem games if possible. So to answer new players' questions, yes, this is the best starting point if you want to get into Fire Emblem, and I can guarantee you, when you finish this game, you will wish you are a longtime Fire Emblem fan.